Welcome to a Pesca Komatati podcast. This edition features a conversation with negotiator Paul Williams. The topic is fisheries from an indigenous perspective. You have a fisheries issue to deal with. Tell me from the indigenous point of view where you begin on that.
The way I've been brought up and taught, you begin by giving thanks that there are fish and that there is a place that the fish live, and you give thanks to the fish for helping you live. You recognize that everything's interconnected. You move from there to understanding in Pesca country that fish are a hugely important component of how people stay alive. And when I say fish, I don't just mean the guys with scales and gills. We're talking about clams, we're talking about crabs, we're talking about lobsters. And where you begin is when the first Europeans showed up in what's now Passamaquoddy Bay in 1603. The people were already there and had already achieved a sustainable, careful way of life in which they used all their territory extensively with a light footprint. And the French, frankly, starved that year because they didn't understand how to live in that place. 100 years later, when people started making treaties nation to nation, the relationship was essentially maintaining a way of life. And those treaties, it turns out, are respected and protected by Canadian law today.
The trouble with marine life in rivers, streams, and the ocean, they don't respect borders. It's all one world for them. How do you deal with that?
Not easy. Not easy because the law in Maine is different from the law 50 meters away in New Brunswick. Not easy because even though the fish are no respecters of imaginary lines, the enforcers of the law sure are. And the way we're dealing with it is by saying this is one nation with a river running through its territory. And the people of that nation will respect the laws of that nation and the laws of that nation, because we have to deal with the United States and with Canada. We will make laws that together, all three nations, will be able to respect and enforce and protect. Because the real bottom line is we're talking about not so much commercial prosperity as what's going to be here for our great-grandchildren.
It doesn't sound like an easy solution, though, once you get that many levels of
not only
bureaucracy, people.
Once you have a legal system that has been ignored for so long, we're rebuilding the house at the same time as we're negotiating the neighborhood.
It's hard to grasp how important is it mostly salmon, or is it is all kinds of shellfish and marine life, but is it mostly salmon?
No, at this point, the last salmon that came up the Scoodic River was 3 years ago, and she was a refugee from a fish farm.
Oh dear.
But aquaculture is a serious issue. That is, if the wild salmon are going to survive at all, we need to deal with the 15 or 20 issues that arise from the use of pesticides, the use of antibiotics, the fact that an escaped farmed salmon doesn't know what family means and will, because they're bigger, will outcompete the wild salmon and then not replace the wild salmon. They don't know how to spawn. So the whole question of how to deal with aquaculture, salmon aquaculture, is huge, and the mouth of the St. Croix River is the most intensive place in Canada
Boy,
for that.
that's an immense problem that I don't think very many people know about.
That's one. The flip side is lobster at this point is extremely lucrative. We're just moving into implementing treaty rights. Where I live, the example I've given the people in Bescoto-Makati country is where I live, the tobacco industry, the cigarette industry is huge, but there are 23 separate cigarette outlets just between my house and the post office. None of those people are making any money to speak of, but the 10 or 15 people who are running cigarette factories are each clearing between $15 and $20 million a year, tax-free. We've ended up with an economic overclass and an economic underclass by taking advantage of treaty-related rights. The
So you've got winners and losers.
Well, the alternative is what the Onondagas did near Syracuse, New York, which is have one cigarette outlet, and the money goes to pay for healthcare and education and language recovery and administration. And really, the Bescoto-Makati are at a crossroads where they're going to have the money to set up a commercial fishery, and they're going to have to choose whether to set up a community-based fishery that helps everybody, or an opportunity for a few individuals to get rich. And so far, the community is pressing for a community-based fishery, but there's pressure from individuals to take the opportunity as quick as they can.
How are you dealing with that?
It's tough. The other example of what's tough is the American eel is endangered in the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes and under a tremendous amount of pressure in Atlantic Canada. American eels sell for $40,000 a pound in Japan.
Oh, wow.
The temptation for people with treaty rights to take as many eels as possible is huge. How do we regulate it? How do we regulate it when people have that much money invested in it? How do we partner with Canada, New Brunswick, and Maine? Among other things, we've said to Canada, before we can justify regulating people with treaty rights, you'd better cut off your licensees first, because they don't even have those rights. But how do you protect an endangered species when there's that much money involved? It's tough. It's especially tough when you're dealing with communities of the poorest communities in Canada's poorest province. That is, we're dealing not just with money issues, but with poverty issues. And we need to face that. And
I can certainly see how the inclination might be to go for the short-term solution, say, oh, okay, go ahead, Use
especially
your
by
rights.
People who have had their rights suppressed for so long that in a way being able to exercise the right is vindication. It's being able to shake a fist back and say, see, we were right, now we can do this, and up yours. Well, no, it's up everybody's.
So philosophically, how do you approach that?
It's tough. It's not just philosophical. The philosophy is easy. The politics is tough. The personalities is tough. They're small communities. Part of it is to sit down with Canada and Maine and the United States and New Brunswick and say, if we want the people to back off a major source of revenue, what do we put in its place? And if we want this together, then what do we have together to replace it? It's a conversation that requires some will and some imagination.
Are the Americans all in this, in Maine, from Maine?
The United States federal government, actually Maine politics and U.S. federal politics are both in a state of some turmoil at this point. Until 2016 we could count on help from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now we're not so sure. The government of Maine has recently adjusted its attitude to be more helpful, but we're not so sure yet there either. And New Brunswick has just had a switch of provincial government last year, and we're still finding our way. So we're dealing with overall negotiations that are fragile critters anyway. But we're looking for issues that we can all agree on. And certainly protecting obviously endangered species is one. Another is where we're dealing with a lobster fishery, for example, we need to convince the neighbors, and they are, that we're not out to displace them. We're out to work with them in a sustainable fishery. And we're lucky because a lot of the neighboring lobster fishermen are fourth and fifth generation people and not multinational corporations that will leave once the lobsters are fished out.
We've heard that story before in Canada.
What's happening is a successional fishery where a species that's fished out, the industry will simply move on to another and another and another until there's nothing left. And part of the challenge is to take the availability of funds and make things better for everybody. A good example is there are 4 dams on the Scoodic River. New Brunswick Power has announced the removal of the largest of them. Each of these dams has a fishway that's over 100 years old and is poorly designed by modern standards. Instead of moving quickly into a commercial fishery, we could set up an enterprise and become the people who design and build and maintain the new fishways. It's still economically viable, but it doesn't threaten the existing fishermen, and it's good for the people, and it's good for the river, and it's good for the fish. So there's ways of doing it, but we need a combination of flexibility and imagination, and then we need partners.
Well, I wish you well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've been listening to a Pesca Komatati podcast. Any views expressed in these podcasts are not necessarily those of the nation, council, employees, citizens, neighbors, or friends. Our objective is stimulating conversation. Thanks for listening. There are many ways to join in the conversation or find out more. The YouTube channel is Pesca Komatati at Scoodic. You can visit the office or write to 27 King Street, St. Stephen, New Brunswick, E3L 2C1. The main office phone number is area code 506-466-2221. The fax is 506-466-2217. Visit the website konaskamcook.com. Facebook is Passamaquoddy at Scoodic Office. Instagram at Passamaquoddy Office. And Twitter at Scouticat.